This is a tutorial to help you write your introduction section. With the introduction, we're going to address several different questions. The first question of interest is, what is your topic? And in the introduction, you'll want to give a general overview of what your topic is, why it's important, and why you would want to know a little bit more about that topic. There are some things that we know quite a lot about and other things that really need to be investigated further. Importantly, who is your target audience? And the biggest question of interest that you need to address is, so what? Just because there's a question doesn't mean that that question is really important. So ultimately, by the end of your introduction and really by the end of your manuscript, you should always be able to answer the question, so what? Now, in addition to identifying what the topic is and giving your reader a general overview of that topic, you want to go ahead and let them know, what is it that we already know? You're not going to be studying a question that's never been investigated before. Most likely there's at least some literature, and in many cases extensive literature, on your topic of interest. And so before you set in on investigating a new topic, you need to let the reader know what we already know about that topic. One of the easiest ways to do that is to find a recent review article. That's a secondary source, and a review article is it's a paper that has already pulled together a number of primary sources. So what you'll be doing with your manuscript would be considered primary literature. But if 100 different groups investigate the same topic and write manuscripts on it, and then somebody else comes along and they write essentially a really big summary of those 100 studies, that would constitute a review article, and that's a secondary source. So while you will not be citing a secondary source in your manuscript, a review article is a fantastic place to become familiar with the topic and also to find other primary sources, because in the reference list of a review article you will generally find a long list of primary references. Be careful, because not all references cited in a review article are primary sources, but the majority of them will be. Now, we know oftentimes quite a bit about a topic before we do a study. So the question is, what don't we know? And even though we'll know quite a bit about a topic, there's often a rather large gap in the literature. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be identifying what that gap in the literature is, and then we're going to identify what little piece of that gap are we trying to address. And what we're going to do is we're going to address a very small fraction of that gap. A lot of times that gap is pretty large, and with a single research study, we're just going to be getting a little piece of that. And if we can address that, then we're making a positive contribution to the literature. And when enough scientific groups get together and study the same topic, and each one studies a fraction of the gap, eventually when you put all those pieces together, we get a much better understanding of what's going on with respect to that given topic. The next several slides will focus in on actually writing your introduction. There are a lot of different ways to organize an introduction, so I don't want you to think that the steps that I'm going to have you go through here is essential, because you can do it a number of different ways, and if you read enough papers you'll realize that there are many different writing styles. So what I'm going to offer you is one way that I know is effective, and it's something that I've utilized for myself. And if you choose to deviate from this, you're fine to do so, and I encourage you to be creative and to do something different. Just realize that if you do something different, you risk it being wrong. So I want you to be creative, but if you have any questions about doing something different from what I'm recommending, I'd recommend maybe running that by me ahead of time. So the format that I'm going to recommend to you is a 4-paragraph format. And you will have an introductory paragraph to your introduction, and you'll have a final paragraph. Now, it may not end up being exactly 4 paragraphs, but ultimately you'll have an introductory paragraph, a final paragraph, and then several body paragraphs. Under this format, your first paragraph would address what is your topic and why is it important. In your second paragraph, you would address the question, what do we already know? So that would be taking, maybe 5 to 7 primary sources and summarizing that information, very similar to what you had to do for your summary assignment. And that should be a heavily cited, extensive paragraph that is a summary of what we already know about the given topic. And then maybe a more brief paragraph without so much citation is what we don't know. Because we don't know it, there won't be a lot of citations in this paragraph. And then your final paragraph would lead into the study purpose and hypothesis statements. Some do's and don'ts of writing your introduction. Don't forget transition sentences. When you have multiple paragraphs, each time you go from one paragraph to the next, there should be a nice transition sentence so that there's continuity, so that the reader seamlessly transitions from the paragraph they were just reading to the new one. And I'll give you one example of a good transition sentence going from your third to your fourth paragraph of the introduction. Feel free to utilize that transition sentence verbatim, but just realize that you need to come up with some other transition sentences for your other paragraphs. Don't assume anything really is common knowledge. Cite everything. It may seem like it's common knowledge to you, but ultimately it may not be common knowledge to somebody else. So to be safe, go ahead and cite any information that you offer up in the introduction. Here are some do's. Do write at least one study purpose and one study hypothesis statement. I have a slide covering what a study purpose is and what a hypothesis statement is, and you must have at least one of each. And then finally, do write everything in past tense. For your introduction, it is assumed that you're writing this manuscript after the study has already been completed, and therefore everything is written in past tense, and that is just convention. A study purpose is a general statement that addresses the bigger research question. For example, in the palm cooling study that we did at Ohio State, the overall purpose of the present study was to investigate the effects of palm cooling on endurance performance. Now, I didn't specifically state for what athletes, what type of endurance performance, so it's a very general overarching statement. We're looking at the association between palm cooling and endurance performance. But then when you write your hypothesis statement is a couple of things. It's directional, and I'll talk about what that is in a moment. It's a prediction. It is a directional prediction, and it's very specific. So unlike the purpose statement that was very general, your hypothesis statement is going to be a specific directional prediction about some outcome measure of interest. In the palm cooling study, the main outcome measure of interest for increased endurance performance was increased time to exhaustion on a treadmill. And what that would mean is if your palm is being cooled, then it's potentially lowering your core temperature and enabling you to run longer before you fatigue and voluntarily stop running. So we wrote the statement, it was hypothesized that treadmill time to exhaustion would be greater with palm cooling than without. And notice what I have in blue text. Treadmill time to exhaustion is a very specific outcome measure. And we didn't say that it would be different with palm cooling. It had to be directional. So we chose a directional term, greater. Greater than, less than would be directional terminology. Different than is ambiguous. It could be greater, it could be lesser. We don't know when you say that something is different. So make sure you use directional terminology in your hypothesis statement.